Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I've been fighting some dragons this morning, so it has been a long day. Let's see how this session goes. My name is Mausama Zahid. I am a Principal PM Manager in Azure SQL Database team. A little bit about myself. I'm a LinkedIn instructor, as well as my ML research is used across the world to detect heart attacks. That has nothing to do with my day job these days, but something for all of you to know. If you have those questions, we can talk about that. I'm very active in many diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I'm one of the co-chairs for Microsoft at Women at Microsoft ERG as well. At my day job, I am responsible for developers. So we talked about many developer features this morning in the keynote, and I'm going to talk about the DevOps lifecycle, which is one part of developer journey. So this session, I'm going to talk about different concepts, ideas. Some of this you might already be using in your DevOps pipeline. Some you might not have heard at all. So I would like to learn from all of your experiences as well, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So with that, this is the agenda. So I'm going to start from very basics, talk about some of the DevOps concepts, some abstractions, some things that we call as the inner loop and outer loop, and some other terminologies that you might already be aware of, but would like to kind of level set this. And then we'll go into the details of some practical solutions, some options that you have for your database objects, especially in the DevOps lifecycle, some ideas and best practices that we have seen from customers' experiences, what is working, what's not working. Again, we are not ideal. We'd like to hear your feedback, things that are working in your environment, and how can we make this DevOps lifecycle best for Azure SQL. And in the end, I'm going to briefly talk about this .NET library called Dacpac. This is like a magic wand for your DB deployment. If you're not aware of that, you'll learn something new. If you're already using it, again, would like to know how you're using it, what is the environment, and how can we make it the best for your DevOps. So let's get started. So why DevOps, right? DevOps impact your application development. I worked in 5 different continents, 5 different countries and 3 different continents, and I worked with many, many teams. And I know how hard it is for your developers to talk to the DB guys or girls or whoever is in charge of that, and the DBAs who are owning your system. And there are many, many, many different kind of complex, either organizational things or system or process issues, where one team or one person or one developer is not talking to another one. So to me, this is the whole life cycle. There are many different concepts. And again, we have only 50 minutes here, so I'm not going to talk about all of that. All of you are here, so I'm hoping that you know most of these concepts or understand. And I'm going to touch a couple of things. So the development lifecycle and the delivery lifecycle. The operation and planning is something that I believe some other person in your team or organization is already taking care of. So when you're talking about the development and delivery of your database objects, what does it mean? There's a lot of development that happens as part of your application lifecycle, and then the database, which is the backend. We have these full stack developers that are building your applications maybe in .NET, Java, whatever language and frameworks that you're using these days. And then you have some backend folks who are responsible to maintain the database. We have, from a developer perspective, done really well with GitHub and Git and many others to make sure that our source code or code is actually source maintained or source controlled. So that has already been done. I've seen many organizations do it very, very well. But where we lack is the DB side of that. And then there's, again, a lot of history where DBAs don't want the developers to touch the database objects. There could be other reasons, and there are, again, some planning and some infrastructure things. So the development lifecycle is an important one, and I'm going to spend some time about some ideas, how you can make sure that you can enable your developers to do the best application development when it involves databases, in this case, Azure SQL. And then, when they're done developing, how do they deliver their code in the code base and the system that you have? So it could be the DevOps, Azure DevOps cycle, some other kind of pipelines, Jenkins, whatever you're using, Chef, whatever is that your life cycle. how does this work? Now, in terms of DevOps impact on development culture, I do want to touch upon that in for a few seconds or a few minutes here as well. I briefly already mentioned about the collaboration, the visibility, and alignment. So if there are two developers who are working on your code, and they're doing some portion of the code, at some point they are committing to the same database, they need to talk to each other. If they don't talk to each other, there needs to be a system in place or process in place that can talk to each other. And I'm going to talk a lot of that and then show you a couple of demos here to showcase how that can be done in terms of the tools and processes that we have from the DevOps lifecycle. The scope and accountability is another piece as well, where you might be solving the tools and process problem, but if you're not solving the scope and accountability in your org or organizations, there is going to be issues in your DevOps lifecycle. So again, some ideas to think about when you go back and talk to your teams and understand who owns what. Release cycles. This is an interesting thing. I know for many, many different applications and customers, they want to have faster release cycle. And if you don't have all of the above that already I've mentioned, they're not going to get to a fast release cycle. So that's important. And then, of course, continuous learning. So while you're doing this, when you have merge conflicts, when you are going through a code base, there are going to be issues. How do you learn from that and make sure your system is resilient? Now, this is an abstraction process. This is what we actually discussed last year as part of Microsoft Build Conference. And we introduced this as inner and outer development loops. They might be called some other things in your organization, but to just kind of explain what I'm going to talk about, the inner loop is when your developers are building things. So they might be doing it on their local machines, Mac, OS, any Windows, whatever machines they're working on. They could be working on containers. So that's all what you're doing from your personal kind of inner loop development perspective. So you might be testing certain things. You might be building the application, connecting the database. So that's from a particular developer perspective. The outer loop may involve many processes and many other things. So that might involve going to the GitHub repo, using PRs, some process around that. It might even involve GitHub code spaces. So we have done some samples that are available, and I'll share some resources with all of you if you want to actually use some of the templates for GitHub code spaces as well. And then all of this kind of talks to your SQL database. And most of the concepts that I'm talking about here are from Azure SQL perspective, but they apply to SQL Server on-prem as well. And again, I have links and resources and videos that you can go and watch in more detail if you have any questions or want to learn more. In terms of source control, I already mentioned about how I look at it from a two different perspective. So there's the local development, which involves code changes, team collaboration, working on multiple different things, and then there are report repositories. So from a GitHub perspective, there could be any change integration process. Sometimes your testing, integration testing, you can include that as part of your remote repository process. But the key component here is source control. And if I can say one thing, when I'm talking to customers and talking to about their database objects, source control is a controversial topic because they don't want to put database objects in source control. How many of you, from just raising your hand, actually have all of your database objects, and that means tables, views, stored procedures, in source control? Most of you. That's good. When I think the talk is done, I can go home. So if you don't remember anything from this session today, and just remember this one thing is source control, your database objects, I think my task is done. But most of you are already doing, so I need to kind of step up and show you some other cool things that you can do. So let's do that. I also want to do another temperature check here. So when we talk about DevOps, we have from our perspective, when we are looking at customers, we have two types of folks. Folks who use dev with ORMs, and folks who use state-based. So how many of you from your DevOps lifecycle use ORMs for database deployments? One. Okay, I think this session is not needed. So this talk is going to be more focused about state-based. So a lot of innovation work that we're doing in terms of our release cycle and DevOps with Azure SQL is on that side. We're not saying that you can't use ORMs. They are still there. They're really good. They work. But a lot of work that we're doing, especially for the SQL projects, and I'm going to talk about what SQL projects is in the state-based processing, state-based development approaches. And across both of them, the automation platforms exist. So the Azure DevOps, GitHub, any of the source control stuff that we already kind of mentioned are across, regardless of if you go the ORM side or you go the state-based side. Now, let's talk about SQL projects. How many of you, again, use SQL database projects? Awesome. So from a SQL project's perspective, you have in your SQL kind of database, you have objects that could be tables, stored procedures, functions. And when we're using SQL projects, they're validated kind of as a complete model. All the references, all of the things specified in the engine that have that capability. In addition to that, we have additional things such as pre- and post-deployment scripts, where you can, for example, want to create users as part of your deployment process. You can do it as a pre-step. Or if you want to do certain cleanups, you can do it as a post-step. And then we have started to kind of work on advanced capabilities such as SQL command. So today in the keynote, we mentioned the Go-based SQL command, and I have a short demo to showcase that as well. So that's one-line command from using that, any kind of command line. You can use that, and then you can have a local SQL database within a minute or two. It's really easy to get started. It costs nothing. And your developers are enabled to do that while they're on a plane, going to a conference, or doing anything. So you will have a SQL database that is workable, that works with all the other different targets, and you can actually get started just with one-line command. So that's some really, really cool stuff. In terms of SQL project development tools, right? So the kind of life cycle we have, the development, the build, and publish. So in the tools that we have, for example, SQL Server data tools, you can have a workload with Visual Studio. And we also have it in SQL Database Project kind of as an extension for Azure Data Studio and VS Code. So we know developers use different tools. They have a tool choice. Different companies have different options to do that. And we have this SQL project available in almost all developer tools. If you have a developer tool right now in your organization that you're using with SQL and that does not support SQL projects, please come and talk to me. I'll be in the booth tomorrow as well. And if you see me otherwise, definitely I would like to chat. So the concept here is the development is usually around T-SQL, right? So you are creating tables, you're creating indexes, creating stored procedures. And then the build process is what we call Dacpac. And I'm going to talk about Dacpac as well if you're not familiar. But most of you raised hand on SQL projects. I'm assuming that you understand what Dacpac is and how it works, at least on a high level. And there's the link on the bottom that you can go and find more about SQL projects from Azure Data Studio, which is built upon VS Code and mostly loved by developers. Now, in terms of constructing a SQL project, right? So this is a simple example. This is what it looks like. It talks about the version that you're kind of building against, and it has certain properties. Some of the additional optional stuff that I briefly mentioned, PostScripts or prescript, there's an example of this. For example, in this case, I'm running a post deploy, a static data script.sql. So when I run that, that particular script will run independent of my rest of the database. So this is what it looks like. And you can actually, in the demo, I'll show you where to find this information as well. It's very easy to read. It's very easy to understand what's happening as well. And we create this for all the steps that you're going to do as part of your SQL projects. What is a Dacpac? And how does that work? So when we are done building, so if I go back to the diagram here, so you're developing, you're creating tables, you're creating indexes, updating, whatever you're doing, developers are doing their own things in the T-SQL. Now they're ready to build. So they right click on their SQL projects and say build. We create a Dacpac for that. And what is a Dacpac? So basically the Dacpac actually includes all of these things. It has the database level settings, the variable values, pre-deployment scripts, the actual SQL projects, and then post-deployment scripts. Now you don't need to use all of that, but depending on how complex your database project is, how complex your environment is, you might be using most of these things. I do want to emphasize about the variables. This is one thing that I see a lot of folks working on different environments struggle a bit as well, where the most common use case is you have a dev environment, a test environment, a UAT kind of environment, and a performance testing environment maybe, and then you have a production. So the easiest way to take your dev lifecycle to production is to use these environment variables that will look exactly the same. All you change is the target environment. And these variables are really, really useful. Again, in some of the GitHub repositories that I'll share at the end, you'll find many, many great examples of how to actually build that for your systems. But it's really important that you understand we take these variables really seriously and we think about what are the impacts of that. And that is one area also I do want to caution you, because what value you provide, we will not know what the value is unless we run this, right? So when the variable is passed in the runtime, we don't know a value. So when you're thinking about variables, think about the things that will look the same from an environment perspective, but change the way you deploy. So the example I gave about dev, test, UAT, performance testing, production is the most common that I see customers using. But I've seen very, very interesting and unique use cases also. And if you have one of those use cases, again, I would like to talk to you and understand, are variables working for you? Are there any limitations? How can we make this the best for you in terms of DevOps? Now, just taking it back to what I talked about, what SQL package is, I explained a little bit about that. I gave you a couple of examples. Now, this is the publish process that I just mentioned. So it creates a Dacpac. And then from a publish process, you can actually publish it to any of the SQL flavors. And from the different toolings that we have available, you can choose the target environment. And it will tell you the warnings and issues right there in your favorite data tool itself. You don't need to go anywhere, go connect to a connection on the target database and see if the table already exists or index already exists and all of that. No, we'll take care of that. That's what the beauty of SQL projects is. And you can also do incremental operations as well. So this is something, again, as a best practice, where if you have changes, try to do it more incremental, more often. Don't wait for like 2 weeks to actually do all of the changes at once. Because at that point, if you have 5 developers, each one is working on something and there are 50 changes, and there are merge conflicts, then somebody needs to make a decision which one is the target one. So try to do more incremental, make sure your processes are actually working in that way as well. You can actually deploy that to a live database or something that you have an emulator. So I will show you a local development environment where you have an emulator that looks like your target database as well. I know a lot of people are really afraid to make these changes to direct live databases, but we have seen many success stories. If you do more incremental and have a process in place to make sure these things are working the way your organization process work, you can do that. Now, let's take an example. It's a very simple example. So you have a Dacpac. It's a create table customer, a couple of columns there. And then you want to actually create a new, basically you started from scratch. This is an example of something to start from scratch, where you created a table, and then you want SQL package to publish to an existing database. And then you can create a new database with the model from Dacpac as well. So for example, if you want to, this is a case where SQL project is really, really effective. So you have a Dacpac, in this case, a customer table that was already existing, and you added a new column in it called region. Now, you don't need to go and write the alter table command for it. That's what the SQL project will do it for you by default. So it will actually create the alter table because it knows the target, it knows what you're sending in, and will create the alter table for you. And the actual execution of that will only include the changes. And again, before you actually publish that, when you build that, you can go into the XML and read through all the steps that's creating, if you really have the time and you really want to make sure that it's doing what you want to really do. But that's one approach where you will save a lot of your time, where nobody has to actually go in and check your target tables, target schemas, target stored procedures to make sure what you have changed. And that right there is a great way to save time for your developers. There's a question.
How would it handle a new column which was not null? So
Which?
You've got existing data in the
Yeah.
table and it's not null.
Yeah.
So when it's nullable, you can go out from null to table out region.
Yeah.
Not null. Does it handle that as well?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And yeah, I can try it out and probably show you tomorrow. Yeah, it does.
I have seen that usually this process fails when we are trying to rename a table.
Yeah. So first I'll repeat that question for anyone who's watching us online. So the question before was, how does it handle the target columns or new columns which are not null? In this example, it's a null. So it does handle it very well. And I was mentioning that maybe I can just quickly test it out and show that to that. And then the second question in the room is, how would it, so we usually fail.
We try to rename a table.
Yeah.
In the, in the source and then try to deploy that change. I have seen that it fails. So we really, we will need to do something in the post deployment script. So it will actually delete the table and then create the table again.
Yeah.
How it will work.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question is, if you're trying to rename the table, it usually fails in the environment for this particular scenario. And should we use post-deployment script in those scenarios? So yes and no, depending on what you're trying to do as part of the change. It's important to understand what are the impacts on the data. So far I'm talking about mostly database objects, right? Starting from scratch, maybe there is some data in there, but if there is already a loaded table with a bunch of rows in there and you're trying to alter it, you need to make sure the data is also persistent with that, and then any query after that is also that. So in this case, it might have the reason that it's failing is because you did not take care of the last step, which is the data piece. So we, towards the end of this, I can show you an example of where data is also part of the post script, and then we kind of alter it. So.
The table contains millions of rows. How?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is if the table contains millions of rows. So we have seen, so the newer SQL project, which is STK style, if you look at the Dacpac that we create, is much more efficient than the regular one. So maybe after this session, we can talk a little bit more in your scenario. If you have like huge footprint of your database and large tables, I would recommend you to go towards this new preview thing, which is the SQL projects with STK style. If you look at the Dacpac that creates, it's much more condensed, it's much more efficient, and we are continuously improving on that. And this is a very, very good feedback and a thing that we have heard from customers before as well. So, how are we doing at time? So let's do some demo. So I've been talking for a while. I talked about local development experience, about the development lifecycle, the delivery of that, and then some of the Dacpac stuff and what Dacpac is, some alter stuff, and some of these examples. Let's talk about how do you do that in the environment. So I'll show you two demos. One demo is about the new Go SQL command, how you can get started very easily for any developer that is in your environment, how they can have a SQL database right almost anywhere, any operating system that they have. And within like few minutes, you can get started, and it costs like nothing. So we announced this thing last year called a local development emulator, which is a VS Code extension. that anybody can use. It's also available in other flavors such as Data Studio and all of that you can use and get started. Again, regardless of what OS, what environment you have, you can get started. Now, from a Go SQL command, it makes the creation of it even simpler. So it's this one-line command, and it will create the database for you. So let's look at this demo. So in this case, I'm going to download a Go SQL command from a package manager, create a SQL Server container, and open it in the Azure Data Studio, all from the command line tool. This demo is using winget to download and install SQL command on Windows machine. The new SQL command is available for Windows, Linux, and Mac, and is compatible with ARM64 and ARM64 CPUs. To create a container, I use the command, in this case, the SQL command create MSS SQL. And with no further parameters passed in, a default container with system databases will be created. Here I'm using the parameter kind of -- using, which references a URL with a .pac file. It will automatically restore the database in the container, and then just went to the ADS part, and it opens the Data Studio right there with one command. It's a pre-recorded demo, so. So in this case, with one command, which is SQL command, I was able to create it and then go to ADS and make sure it's done. And then if you're done, you can do SQL command delete -- force, and the container will get deleted. And you can go to see in the Docker desktop that it's deleted. So it all just happens really instantly, I can never pronounce that word, really in a few seconds. Questions? Excitement? Okay. So we talked about the DevOps concept, we talked about the life cycle, we talked about what is SQL projects, we talked a little bit about Dacpac. We heard a couple of issues which are really top of mind for many customers, and I mentioned slightly about the new SQL projects, which is the SDK style. And then I showed you what this new Go SQL command is to get your developers started on any of the environments. There's a local container that's running, and you can use it within a minute or less than a minute. Now I'm going to show you an end-to-end developer lifecycle demo, where we're going to start with a local development experience. We're going to publish some stuff. We'll not just be using tables, we'll also add a column to an existing table. We'll also add a new stored procedure, and then we'll see how the whole process works. And last but not least, when you're done with that inner loop, we want to talk about live databases and the repository side of things as well. So I'm going to show you this thing called GitHub Actions, and see when you're done with all of that, you want to trigger a GitHub action which starts your deployment process in the target repository as well. Everyone still with me? Let's do that. It's also pre-recorded because I was trying to do this demo on Tuesday, and the system didn't work. So let's see if it works this time. Okay, so from a developer experience perspective, so I'm starting from the point that you have an existing SQL project. The SQL project looks like this. You will have, in this case, I have certain tables. I also have, this is what the SQL project will look like, and this is where you can find all the information that I was mentioning, the PostScript, pre-script, things that you can find out that what is going to get created, what you want to run. In this case, I also have a post-deployment script which populates a particular table with certain data. Now, this is the post-deployment script. Now let's go into this particular table, which is the CSAT by month, and add a new column. It's a computed column, so it's not a straightforward column. I'm computing it based on certain values. And I'm going to add it in my environment right here. Once I'm done, and I'm happy with it, I'm going to build. So it should build up. If there are any warnings or issues, it should show that there are certain issues, that this column, maybe data type doesn't exist or whatever, like if it's not supported. In this case, no issues, that's all good. And now I'm ready to publish. Now when I'm going to publish, let me pause it here for a second. You have a few options. So you want to publish to an existing database, you want to publish to a brand new database, or something remote. So in this case, yeah. Sorry. Sorry, you have to see that all again because I paused it. So that's the SQL project. There's the post-deployment script. And then we are going to add a column to this. Okay, so we're ready to publish. In this case, we are going to publish to a local kind of container, and we're going to provide the information about that. And in this case, this is the new thing that I mentioned, the local Azure SQL Database Emulator. So it will create a container for me. It will look exactly like the objects that are in this project, and it will create those. It will ask you a few things here as well. Once you say done, it's done. I'm switching over to show you from VS Code that you can actually see the table and everything to Azure Data Studio to show you all the objects that were created in that environment. Everything looks good, and we have this particular table which shows M. So there's some merge conflict, something has changed. In this case, it will show you that column that is different, which is the quarter column that I added. You can right click and actually go to the next level and see them side by side as well, and accept or reject those things. It also shows the formula that's the one I used. Now, if you are happy with that, and this local development environment looks good for you, now you want to update your target live database with the changes. You're going to select that, and then again, right click, do that. It just shows you. And here is where you'll see the comparison side by side of all the changes between your local database environment and the target environment. In this case, I didn't show you a part where there is also a variable change. So your environment is usually more complex than just the object changes. There could be variable changes, there could be other things, indexes, all of the above. Now, we have the new environment running. Connecting through again the SQL login to that. And it is reflected in the objects. The change is there. Now, one last thing. So you are in the live database here. And from the stored procedure itself, I'm going to go ahead and create a new stored procedure right in that environment. So it's the reverse lifecycle where somebody is doing changes in your live database, and then you want to make sure all of your other developers also are aware of this. So in this case, this is the new database, a new stored procedure that I'm going to go ahead and create. Once I'm happy with the code, it's the same stored procedure but by quarter. Just updating that. I will go back and then publish it. In this case, I'm going to publish to an existing Azure SQL environment. Lost still here? Understanding? Okay. It will start deploying the Dacpac. It will show me that this is currently using the MS SQL extension, and then it should take a few minutes, depending on how complex your environment is, and it should deploy. And there it is. Now, the last step, so this can go in many kind of phases, right? So you have different developers working on different things. They could be doing updates to your database objects. They could be deploying new objects. They could be adding indexes. They could be adding new columns, all of the above. So you'll follow this process across that and make sure you're doing incremental changes. Once you're ready with all of this and you want to make sure that you use GitHub Actions, in this case, it creates a very good YAML file that you can connect to a GitHub action. And that will trigger a GitHub action that will go and deploy these changes to your target database using an Azure DevOps environment or a GitHub operations environment, whatever you have in your cases. So in this case, when I'm done, I'm making a commit saying that added a new stored procedure. Going right there, you can see that there is the build and deploy action created, and it will start deploying and running the changes. Again, simplified, kind of oversimplified some of the steps here, but this is what we see a lot of customers doing in many different scenarios where they have the inner loop where many developers are working different things, changing different database objects, and then there's the live database where you can time to time check and update from your perspective. You can keep working in your local environment as well, and then from your pipeline perspective, your CI/CD pipelines, testing pipelines, you can actually start using GitHub Actions to start the actual deployment. Questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, I'm going to just quickly recap everything that we talked about so far. There are some new concepts maybe, there are a few things you already know about, there might be some concerns with your environment, so we'd like to again know about that. So in terms of local development recap, we talked about how do you, this is actually a local kind of emulator, it can get you quickly getting started with SQL projects, with container instances, and then for the SDK style SQL projects, which is in preview right now, again, there was a good question in the room about that. It makes the work kind of more easier for multiple developers to work together or database developers to work together. Please, please, please keep your database objects in source control, which most of you said you do. So that's the one thing you need to remember for sure. In terms of the process we already talked about, it's right there. You can build, publish, you can update the project from database. Now, this is the question that we were talking about, touched upon a little bit. So in terms of SQL package actions, so I talked a lot about this session in terms of the Dacpac and schema and the objects part of things, right? I did not talk a lot about the backpack, which is the database. That would require another 50 minutes to go into that detail, but I would be happy to talk about how data and objects come together in this whole DevOps lifecycle. But in your environments, there is always data. Their objects do not exist without data. And we're seeing more and more customers kind of bringing both the worlds together, and that's why they're almost named the same as well, like Dacpac and Backpack. So it's schema plus table. So when you're thinking about your DevOps lifecycle, it's important to think about how does your changes affect the data as well, and what is your plan to update those tables. So if you're changing, let's say, the cardinality, or you're changing something else which fundamentally breaks the existing objects, how is this going to impact your data? And that's where the post scripts are really, really your best friends. And the SDK style will help you, and it was much more condensed as well. We have many case studies and examples again in our GitHub repositories that you can look at with what we see as common practices. And again, if you have any specific use case or questions, I'm happy to go into that. SQL package, again, if anyone here does not, most of you said you use that. This is very simple. You can just use one line command to install that. Again, just recap of everything. This is what the common syntax of SQL package looks like. You can specify a lot of additional parameters. In this case, there is a Dacpac also, the target where the Dacpac will go. You can provide other actions as well on top of this. When you build and deploy, so we've talked about the CI/CD pipelines. Again, that is a topic a lot of folks think about. So when you're running those, it's important to you think about CI/CD pipelines overall as well. And that's where SQL action is your friend. I will provide you a couple of links at the end, so you can learn more about SQL actions, how you can actually use this to actually deploy in your GitHub environments as well. And they could be bidirectional. So a lot of folks are like, what? Yes, it's possible. Last but not least, I briefly hinted upon this when we started this session, which is the Dacfx. As I said, it's a magic wand, and it solves magically all your problems in DevOps environment. If you have a data tier application framework, there is a thing called Dacfx. It's a library. It's available in NuGet. It's available as .NET Core or .NET Framework, depending on what environment you have. And it's available in all of our kind of Azure SQL environments, toolings that are available there as well. So when we are talking to a customer, maybe your scenario, which we were talking about earlier, we see two types of things. Where let's say you have an environment where you want to update all your tables and stored procedures, but not the ones which start or end with a particular name. So different customers have environment where table names, which are, let's say, these admin tables, and I don't want any developer to come and touch those. This is the common thing that I hear from DBAs, that I don't want developers to touch these tables, and they can't be in source control, don't touch them. So you will fall into this category where, again, Dacfx is your friend. You can start, so again, there's a good tutorial that I will link at the end. You can use that. So you can write this functionality on top of this Dacfx library, or you can use contributor to for SQL package, contributor for SQL package to update that. And I'll give you an example quickly here. This is an example of when you want a deployment using Dacfx, where you don't want a particular name of a table or object, for example, in this case, customer, to not part of your changes. So this is what the command would look like. Oversimplifying it, but it's possible. And we have seen customers use it, and I would be happy to know more about your environment as well. So last but not least, just summarizing everything that we talked about. So we talked about the inner loop, the local development experience. We talked about the GitHub Actions. We talked about the talking to Azure and deploying it to target database. These concepts, very, very high level again, that was possible in these 50 minutes. These are all the links. If I'm not able to get to your questions, you're free to connect with me afterwards as well. We have amazing set of product managers who are working on these capabilities. I might not know all the answers, so I would definitely like to connect you with the folks working on these tooling side as well. There are a couple of great videos that we did on Azure Fridays and on code spaces. So again, I did not go into a lot of details about GitHub code spaces, but we have this video and a sample code associated with this in these links. We have 5 more minutes, I guess.
Online question.
Yep.
Is there any timeline for the SQL database project extension to come out of preview?
Is there any timeline for?
The SQL database project extension to come out of preview.
Yes. So the question is there any timelines for SQL database projects to come out of preview? We are working on it. We can't commit to any timeline, especially when we are in these conferences. We can't do that. But we are working towards that sometime this year. Any questions in the room? Everything was super clear? Okay, there is a question.
So we keep our database objects in source control, but you talked about a situation where someone creates a stored procedure and you want to get that into your source control, but that doesn't sound like keeping your objects in source control. That sounds like they're not in source control and you're getting them a bit later on. Have I missed something there?
Yeah, so the question is we talked about a scenario where I created a new stored procedure which was not part of the initial objects, and you're saying this kind of unlikely not to happen, right? Very good question. So yes and no, but we have seen folks do that. So especially when you have application development teams who are working on a different side of things, which are dealing directly with data dumping, and then your DBAs or any kind of data management folks who are dealing with creating these stored procedures or some of the additional stuff, they're doing separately. So when these two teams are mostly not talking to each other, that's where we've seen these scenarios where stored procedures are usually an afterthought sometimes, and they're added in later part of your life cycle. But if you start from scratch in any environment, there would be cases where this can happen. In your case, you might have started, like all of them started with the source control, maybe SQL project is right there, but we have seen examples of where customers don't think about all of these objects right from the start. So it was just showing you an extreme kind of case where you add objects and some things as well later in your life cycle, especially in live databases, where you don't want to.
I have one question.
Yep.
You said that put all the databases in source control. I think it will only work for the small databases, not for the large databases. So if I have a 1 terabyte database and I would like to use Git, how can I put that in source control with the Azure Studio?
Yeah, so the question is if you have a large database, how can I put that in this example like 1 terabyte? So I would like to know about your limitations in terms of does it take too long? That's feedback, yes. It takes a lot of time to update.
So I've done research on this thing 3-4 years ago, and for this we need to use right-grade technology like SQL clone.
Yeah.
And that's the reason we didn't put it in source control, because SQL provision, I think the product is SQL provision, and it was £7,000 per terabyte per year. So how can we achieve putting all the databases in source control if they are large in size?
Yeah, that's a very valid feedback and concern. So thinking about dividing that into smaller chunks is an idea, and I would like to explore more from your perspective. This is a very common feedback, and I know many products are out there that are trying to solve like the one you gave an example. We are innovating in this space with the SQL projects SDK style that I mentioned, where you will see in the next few it's in preview right now, but in the next few months we are innovating in the space of larger databases. So that is the very feedback we're trying to get to. Yeah, it's a very valid concern.